For the big red light. We are recording. Okay, and welcome along. My name is Phil Kersley. I'm the head of stats here at Carmel College, and I am very kindly joined by Dr. Yan Birch, who is a teaching fellow at Durham University. How are we doing, Yan?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much for having me here. It's great to be virtually, of course.
Yeah, do you know what? At one point, I started the video like this, and I don't need that. Thank you, Yan. Thank you for joining me. It means a great deal. So obviously, Yan teaches psychology at Durham University. I think it's fantastic the fact that I'm getting the opportunity to speak to someone who actually works at Durham, because it's such a prestigious university, and obviously our students were trying to push for competitive universities, because everyone thinks of, top universities and think of Oxford and Cambridge, but if you're looking at the top 10, the Russell Group and the Sutton 30, Durham is a fantastic institution, so it's definitely worth looking into.
Absolutely.
Yan, teaching psychology, obviously I'm the head of stats. I think some students will be like, don't I need to be taking A-level psychology to study psychology as a degree?
Absolutely not. One of the things that I think one of the great things about psychology at university is the fact that there is no prerequisite of doing psychology at an A-level. Mostly because, by all means, if you're interested in psychology at this stage, take it on, because the psychology A-level is a great starting point, and will give you a lot of really good information about ideas what we do, and get you started on the kind of methodological journey. But if it's something that you're not keen to do right now, but it's perhaps an option, if you don't do psychology, it's not going to stop you from getting to us and being a great psychology student at the end of the day, mostly because we just assume we don't ask for it, so we just treat everyone exactly the same when it comes to our curriculum. We have core topics that we have to teach as part of our accreditation from the British Psychological Society, which is kind of like a quality assurance type thing. So every psychology degree across the country worth its salt will have that BPS accreditation. So do look out for that if it's something you're looking for. But again, because of that, we have to teach certain things. And so essentially, there's no point in asking for that psychology A-level as a prerequisite, because we're going to teach you all that kind of fundamental stuff anyway as part of that. So if you want to do psychology at A-level, please do. But if it's something that I'm interested in a lot of other things, but I also want to do psychology at university, you do those other things, because when you get to us, you'll still be fine.
So that's reassuring, because some students might not necessarily do stats plus psychology, even though it's a fantastic overlap when it comes to two subjects at A-level. So would you recommend maybe a science?
Absolutely. Because psychology, in terms of the grand scheme of science, is a relatively new science. We've been only really formally as a discipline for about 120, 130 years at this point. So there's lots of things going on within psychology, more broadly speaking, in terms of what we call paradigm shifts, like ideas and the big schools of thought and stuff like that, and how we conceptualize things. And so because of that, and because we're not as well established as things like biology, chemistry, and physics, and all that, the kind of the old sciences, some would argue that we perhaps have to hold ourselves to a much higher standard in terms of our scientific method. So some of the papers that you'll read in our particular field will perhaps be more rigorous in terms of statistics and methodology than you may in some of the great physics and chemistry papers, for example, which is quite funny in my opinion. But that aside. But again, because of that, we adhere ourselves to a very rigorous scientific method as much as we possibly can, and so having a bit of a scientific background is a really good starting point, because it kind of gets you used to that way of thinking, because we're dealing with data, we're collecting data, and we're having to look at that critically. And what is science about? Looking at data critically. So yeah, having a science background coming into a psychology degree is a great starting point for sure.
Brilliant. So in terms of, you said the rigor. So my head went straight to significance levels. Do you discuss significance levels in your courses?
All the time.
Right.
Okay. Time. You can't get away from it.
So in terms of what you teach in terms of data analysis and your scientific methods, what type of stats would my students have covered that maybe you'll be teaching or may sound familiar?
So typically the most common ones that students will be familiar with when they get to us, ordinarily, if you've covered some form of statistics beforehand, which a lot of students have nowadays, you've probably heard of things and covered a little bit of things like t-tests, so means testing, and probably things like Mann-Whitney U, Wilcoxon, sign test, and things like that. So yeah, that's kind of like the starting point that we typically work with in terms of like when we do things with groups, for instance. So yeah, looking at the differences between parametric and non-parametric methods, the assumptions that we have, when it's appropriate to use one and not the other. Another thing that I'm sure you probably would cover this as well is probably correlations, as well, and that's another really big like fundamental part of actually even some more sophisticated techniques that you learn in your second year, and as perhaps part of your research project as your final year as well. So that's another thing that is like, you know, this groundwork statistically feeds into the more complex stuff as you go through, but it's just natural building blocks. So some of it sounds complicated, but it's just all built on previous knowledge that we give you anyway.
You've basically I've just got my spec in front of me. You've ticked off so much. I think you've said non-parametric tests, so sign test, which is a form of proportion testing as well. It's a simple version of that. Mann-Whitney is what it used to be called on our AQA spec, but now referred to as Wilcoxon rank sum test. And of course, our kids do and our kids do a lot of Z and T testing. So yeah, that's fantastic. That's really reassuring. So you can see how A-level stats might actually help the first year or so in a psychology degree, maybe.
Absolutely, and I think having that familiarity is a really great thing. Again, it's not something. I know, of course, you're the head of statistics at your institution, but it's one of the things.
You don't have to have it.
You don't have to have it, no, because we cover it, but it's also one of the things that if I know students who've come to us have that little bit of background, it kind of helps me feel a little bit easier about the way that students kind of, you know, settle into the course, because probably one of the biggest things that students have as a kind of a stumbling block when they get to us is the statistical side of things. A lot of students are not necessarily comfortable with it, and it's understandable because it's like, you know, dealing with numbers all the time, looking for tests like what do these particular values mean, what's important values, what's not important values. We throw a lot of information at you, and it's such an integral part of psychology because of the research aspect that you can't really avoid it. But sometimes it can look very daunting when we're running these particular like computer programs, which is like spit out number. We do some stuff by hand as well, just to kind of give you a feel. But like there's a lot of computation side of things, and you're seeing all these numbers on a screen, and it's kind of like, whoa, what's this? But you know, we guide you through that. But that because of the way that it's kind of thrown at you in a way, it does overwhelm some students. So if you have kind of like a bit of a grounding in it. I can immediately tell in my cohorts who's had a bit of experience with statistics before, not even necessarily psychology, just some form of statistics, because they feel a lot more at ease. And I think that kind of like takes a little bit of the stress out of it. And, you know, I think it does help you ease in a bit more. And like, you know, all of our students will, you know, overcome that kind of like that, what we call threshold concept.
Yeah, I also teach on the maths A level as well, and I know there's 1/6 of the course which is a little bit of stats. There's a little bit of correlation. There's a little bit of means testing, but nowhere much as in depth as we do. They don't do any non-parametric tests to give you an idea. That's fantastic. So like I said before, Dr. Yan is a teaching fellow at Durham University, a very prestigious place. What do you do besides teach?
My research is
well, you know, what interests you about psychology?
It's just that we know so much about the mind, yet we know so very little, and that we have this essentially pilot of our body in the brain, that we all have one. Although sometimes I may act like I don't have one sometimes, but we all have this we all share this particular fantastic bit of machinery, yet we are all so remarkably different in many, many different ways, and it's the capacity to be the same but different across a number of people, and my initial interest in it came from you know, actually being trying to figure out what happens when things go wrong in the brain, and then subsequently what the psychology behind that, and then also how can we help people who have things that are not functioning in quite the same way. So that's where I initially came.
Dementia and Alzheimer's and.
Most of them was psychopathology, yes. I'm very much kind of like clinically oriented to begin with, and much of my research is kind of like geared towards that now. My primary research interests actually revolve around depression and things like that. So I'm particularly interested in emotions, broadly speaking, but a lot of my work is like looking at theories of depression, different elements of depression, like different depressive symptomology, how that potentially impacts on individuals and their ability to adhere to certain treatments, be it medication or behaviorally. So you know, with lots of group comparisons and lots of correlations as well, looking at how like different levels of symptomology relate to different abilities, and whether there's different relationships in terms of like, if you have greater symptomology of a certain type, does that actually correlate with poor performance and different cognitive tests and things like that, to kind of get a much broader idea of what's going on, and so like kind of, you know, to help shape where we go next with our questions. And that how ultimately my aim is to, with my research, is to perhaps come up with new ways that we can help treat people with depression, or potentially modify what we've got already. So I think we've got a good idea, but a lot of what our treatments are based on now.
That is so noble. Honestly, that is so noble. I'm so glad that I got into this conversation with you. A topic very close to my heart is mental well-being. So obviously, depression and anxiety is something I feel quite strongly about. So it's been lovely to speak to you about that. I suppose the last little thing I would talk about is, obviously we've discussed how you teach a little bit of stats a little bit. You know, you teach stats in your methods course. What else? What other components have you taught in terms of? I know for a fact there's a new course that you're currently rebranding. Is that correct?
Of course, yes, indeed. I'm currently developing this for the availability for our final years next year, so should hopefully be well and established by the time anyone hopefully gets to us at some point in the future, if anyone decides that they want to come to us. So little bit of bigging us up there. So yeah, obviously we cover a lot of, you know, core psychological stuff, but we know most people who come to study a psychology degree don't end up going to do psychology jobs. And so one of the things that I've been developing and will be basically rolling out for the future, starting with next year, is something that we call psychology in the workplace. And it's a module for our third year students and their final year students, whereby we offer the opportunity for them to go out into the wide world of work and work with local companies or like the council or things like that, to work on a project with them, covering like about half of the academic year, where they'll get to use some of the skills that they've developed as part of their psychology degree on that project. And what we mean by that is not going into a workplace and, you know, using psychology in the sense of counselling or things like that. What I'm talking about is using those data analytical skills, that critical thinking, the ability to like look at information and pick out the key stuff to present arguments and things like that. So we've had students who've gone to work with local law firms, for example, to work on cases and picking out information and kind of presenting arguments to help them. We've had students who work with the local council in various ways. We had one student working with the local council on licensing and looking at kind of like different licensing policies and comparing data and saying like what different counties around the UK had licensing policies which seemed to work, and comparing, you know, actually literally doing statistics to figure out which ones were significantly different from each other in terms of like number of crimes and things like that. And the really cool thing about that particular project, when we had because because we had to stop it essentially because of COVID, so I'm revamping it and bringing it back. But like, so in the old ones we've had basically that licensing project, a student actually got to go out on licensing raids. So they were out with the local police force at 2 o'clock in the morning in the police cars, going to these unlicensed premises and raiding them and stuff like that. Then got to go along and check it all out as well. So it's not just the ability. So what I find really great about it is, again, sort of like bringing it back and changing a few things about it, because obviously to fit in with the world that we now live in, because COVID and stuff like that. So there's a few things about maybe you can do remote working potentially and stuff like that. But that aside, is that it's not just the ability to kind of take what you've learned and see how you can see how it applies beyond psychology into an actual workplace, and how you can use those to like kind of recognize what skills you have which make you employable in a vast number of industries. But it can also open up a number of opportunities that to experiences that you would never get anywhere else. Literally once in a lifetime. That's, I mean, who would, unless you work in licensing, who's ever going to get the opportunity to go on a licensing raid, for example? And I would say, like, and when we've done initiatives like this before, actually we've had a pretty good, strong track record of students who've gone to work with these on these types of projects and actually being offered employment off the back of these projects as well. So it really increases employability, and it is just a fantastic thing, which a lot of people don't, necessarily think about, but it's an important aspect. So. Yeah.
Do you know what? That was brilliant, because not only was it exciting that the police, they actually got to go on a raid with the police cars, but the fact that you said transferable skills, granted what you're learning you won't necessarily do in your workplace, but the skills that you've learned, the techniques, can be applied to the real life situation. That's fascinating, because that's what I've been saying to my kids.
Well, absolutely, and it's one of those things. I don't think it's unique to psychology. I think it's actually endemic across a lot of different courses, but it's something that I think, from our perspective as academic provisioners, that sometimes we forget that we're teaching all of these skills, but it's easy for us to see how those skills transfer into jobs and things like that. But putting ourselves in the shoes of students, it's not that easy to see how this skill translates somewhere else, and to recognise that these are skills that employers are looking for. So the thing that I really, really champion with this particular module, not just because I'm going to be in charge of it, but putting it together, is that it hopefully gives students the opportunity to see just how valuable they are.
Yeah.
Because by the time that you get to the end of the degree with us, in fact, any institution, because there's obviously, I'm going to big up Durham, but there are lots of great institutions around the UK, but Durham's best. It's amazing how many students don't recognise the skills that they have, and just how valuable they are to the workplace, and that's a really thing that I'm really proud of with these types of this type of work that I'm doing, is that it really empowers students and recognises that they are worth something, that they have these skills that people want, and they are valuable. And that's, I think, just as important as the experiences that they get.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jan. I really appreciate the time you've given me, because I know you're a very busy man. We are both in amidst exam season, so we're both marking papers and papers and papers. So yeah, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for doing this for us.
No, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Cheers, Jan. Thank you.
Take care.